Hello and welcome to the Great British Kitcar, where we show some of the history of the Great British Kitcar industry. Now, we don't claim to cover all of it because, quite frankly, that would be nigh on impossible. And anybody who has designed and built a kit and offered it to the public is a hero. Whether you like the kit, whether I like the kit, it takes an awful lot to get to that point, and we have to appreciate them for what they do. In this video, we enter the realm of the kit form supercar, born of racing, but evolved into the perfect road car. In fact, the ultimate road car. So, as you can see, we have reached the 1980s and the dawn of the kit supercar. Now, the thing with the kit car industry is that up until the 80s, there were lots of cars that looked exotic and they were beautiful. Cars like the Nova, absolutely stunning, looked like a supercar, went like a Beetle. Nothing wrong with that. It was designed as a visual feast and it fulfilled that role perfectly. But there were people who hankered after something that could deliver the goods. And the first car that we're going to cover was a replica of a car that moved the mid-engined supercar in a way into the mainstream by being a Ford product. It may have been a racing car, but it was a foretold what was to follow. And it was, of course, the GT40. And the very first gentleman to create a GT40 replica was a gentleman called Ken Vincent Atwell. And Steve Hole is about to tell you the story.
This time, straight into it. I've been nagged for being making the videos too long, so we're gonna do these voiceovers a little bit quicker. So straight into this one. People often ask, and forgive me if you know about what I'm going to talk about, forgive me. Hopefully you'll learn a few bits and bobs that you didn't know. But if you are new around here, then yeah, you might be interested in just getting a bit of background. We're going to look at a very nice chap called, well, the late Ken Atwell. And Ken Vincent Atwell gave his initials to a company called KVA. And people often ask, who are familiar with, say, sports racers and historic motorsport, when they find out about GT40 replicas, they often ask, and only the other day someone asked me what was the first GT40 replica in the UK. And I can answer that one. That was Ken. That was Ken Atwell. Now let's go straight back to the beginning. Ken was a senior automation engineer at Ford Motor Company's Bridgend plant. I think they did gearboxes and engines there. Definitely gearboxes near Swansea. He lived in a place called Hendrefoilen. Now I probably murdered that pronunciation, and if any people listening in Wales, then forgive me for that. I'm doing my best with my South London accent. But anyway, he did lots of stuff when he was at Ford. He was an automation engineer, but he was also in charge of keeping an eye, making sure that the fleet of cars they had there, because Ford, I think most of their factories have at least a couple of historic cars from their past, and certainly Bridgend plant was no different. And indeed, they had a GT40 in their foyer. And Ken's duties were to look after that because it was often lent out for various TV exhibitions, all sorts of appearances, and right down to dealer promotions, I believe. And inevitably, they come back with a few disgustings and whatever, because not everybody, unfortunately, keeps an eye on their zips and their key rings and such like, and quite inadvertently, car bodies end up with scratches and other little sort of areas that they didn't have when they arrived. Anyway, so Ken was particularly fond of the GT40, and I think way before KVA, he looked at producing his own replacement panels out of fiberglass or glass fiber, beg your pardon. And I think his love for the 40 came about when he was given the chance to drive that Mark III that they had at Bridgend on a promotional appearance at, I think, Zandvoort and Nürburgring. and he was given a chance to have a little go, as we say, and that kind of just cemented his love for the car. One day he asked for permission from his bosses there to produce a replica for his own use, and of course the background to that was that if he made some replacement panels or such like, then if the car that they had in the foyer needed any replacement panels, then he would be able to produce them or have them on hand indeed. There's a fallacy that he made the car for his daughter. He didn't. He previously made a Morgan 4.4 replica type roadster, which I believe was used by his daughter, and he made that from scratch. Actually, he did show me a photo of it once, but I don't have one, and I don't know anybody that does, to be honest. So, but he made it from scratch out of box steel, chassis structure, aluminium sheet, and glass fibre. And he based that on 4 Cortina Mark III components. The only Morgan parts on it, incidentally, were I think the windscreen and surrounds and the radiator grille. But his first GT40, let's go back straight to that. That's what we're really talking about. That first GT40 that he splashed, or sorry, took a mould from the Ford one, from Ford's foyer car. I nearly said Gate Guardian there, but you know what I mean. Always intended to be for his own use and as his own daily transport, and indeed that's what he does. And it was registered actually as a KVA special on the V5C. I think he built it in just 4 months too. But he was a skilled engineer, and so he was no stranger to turning his hand to a variety of artisan crafts. And I think he previously restored a 13th century cottage. He'd raised sunken yachts, restored a selection of vintage motorbikes, and I think he'd even built a bungalow, which later acted as the KVA office. I know that for a fact. So he was a real dab hand at turning his hand to all sorts of interesting subjects. His GRP work was done by the gifted Peter Jacobs. Now he is an artisan of the world of glass fibre. He'd been responsible for we'll come to that, but he'd worked on the first shell of the RS200, the Ford RS200. We'll come to that. There's a sort of a sidebar to that story which involves Ken. And he'd also made ocean-going yachts. I think he did. Well, he definitely worked with a guy called Emilio Garcia at EG Autocraft, who were producing a Daytona clone prior to getting stuck into the KVA. And he was a real artisan, Peter Jacobs. That first KVA GT40 Mark III shape was underpinned by a box steel space frame. But rather than the original thin wall monocoque, and it was a beefy chassis for sure. He certainly adopted a belt and braces approach to Ken, and he claimed his panels on the car were better than the Ford original, and that they fitted obviously an original GT40. Shot lines were good and very even, and you know I think there were 19. I think it's 19. And I won't say no 19. Forget that. Separate panels. But he's a full man through and through, so unsurprisingly Ken opted to use components that he had experience with, that were easy to source and that he had easy access to indeed. Even though that Mark III model variant of the Mark GT40 was nominally the road-going GT40, it could never be described as civilized. But on the other hand, Ken's version was specifically designed for the purpose, and I remember him. He came out with some very good quotes, Ken, and he told me once with a smile on his face that even lousy cars have some good parts. I remember him talking about Cortinas and stuff. So anyway, so he used the Cortina Mark III, although you could use a Mark IV as well, because it's basically the same car under the skin. And he used the suspension components from that car at the front end. And this did attract a bit of criticism from GT40 purists, because obviously the original had a sort of a wishbone arrangement. Ken went for trailing arms from box steel, mounted on transit van spec metallastic anti-vibration bushes. It was a sturdy thing. Transaxle, actually, you automatically would think he would go for a UN1, the Renault UN1, or a ZF or something. No, he went for a Volkswagen variant, which he claimed could cope with V6 engines. And he said if a customer wanted to fit a V8, he'd just specify a Granada item instead, gearbox instead. Talking of engines, his first version had an XR3, Ford Escort XR3 spec CVH actually, 4-cylinder with a Roto Master turbo, which could, Ken said, do 140 mile an hour. However, the recommended fitments for the subsequent production KVAs were Ford Cologne V6, Rover V8, or Ford 302 V8. Going back to those wishbones, I should have mentioned that at the time. He said he originally considered wishbones at the rear of his car, but he felt that the suitable proprietary parts that he would have to use were too heavy, too wide, or a combination of both. But he did, and this is where it gets a bit confusing with KVA, because people think of them just as doing GT40s. They didn't, which we'll come to later. But he also came up with various incarnations of the chassis for that car to suit different applications as time progressed. He came up with a C-type chassis, which doesn't mean that he did a Jaguar C-type, far from it, although he did do a D-type, but we'll come to that in a minute. But that was an upgraded version that could cope with more powerful engines. But as I say, we'll talk about that. Rumours are that, and I've spoken to a couple of people that were proud of their KVRs, as you would be, but they weren't an easy car to build by any means. They weren't really a novice's car. But as I say, I said to a few people, you know, it's a bit like as Eric Clapton introduced us to the joys of a Les Paul guitar through a Marshall amp. Ken holds a distinction of creating the first GT40 replica. Nobody can take that away from him. However, all the customer got was an 18-page booklet listing the extra parts required for the build and tips on the best places to obtain them. I think he assumed an element of knowledge from anyone that wanted to build one of his cars. The only original GT40 component on that first KVA actually was the windscreen, which was sold exclusively via a company called Sebic Automotive Developments, who had paid for the tooling that Triplex had produced from originally. The KVA customer was expected to fabricate stuff, I think stuff like the gear linkage mechanism and other components, and these vagaries and the fact that GT Development's co-founder Ray, the Rodfather Christopher, had driven the original KVA, and I think had said to Ken that he didn't much, or he thought the suspension could be improved, which quite incidentally is how from early '84 Ray and his business partners at the time, Graham Kelsey and Roger Attaway, began offering a variety of what they called missing KVA parts and a suspension upgrade kit. I don't think Ken was too pleased to start with, but they, although I think they had what could be described as a sort of knife-edge relationship, GTD were appointed as official licensees for the KVA, along with another company in the northeast of England called Phoenix MCR, who were also licensees. I've seen a quarter-page advert from that period, 84, 85, which talks about the ultimate KVA, and I think it was a KVA advert describing the best of KVA, but built by GTD with the GTD parts that KVA didn't supply, if that makes sense. Although I talked to Ray very recently, I'm recording this in July 2025, by the way, and he has no recollection of that, but I've seen the advert, so I don't quite know what was happening there. But anyway, GTD had their license removed in 1986, and I think MCR, run by Terry and Diane Moore, I think, and in fact they weren't in North East of England, they were in East Yorkshire, or the East Riding of Yorkshire. It seems to switch between East Riding and East Yorkshire. It's one and the same place, I think, but I don't know which one they're using at the moment, to be quite truthful with you. And much like GTD, they built their own version of the KVA with a few parts of their own ideas, but they did stick with Ken's original Cortina suspension setup on their car. But anyway, in 1985, Ken estimated that if a customer used all new components on a KVA, a DIY build budget of $18,500 would be required. And I imagine there'd be a few takers 40 years later for $18,500. He even reckoned that if you used a certain amount of reconditioned parts, that figure could be reduced to £8,000. and his kits cost from 3,000. I didn't mention when that first car that he built had hit the road. It was 1982, June 1982, and he really did use it for all his trips and his errands and his various chores on a day-to-day basis. And after a few months, I think a well-known motoring journalist of the day called Howard Walker, really good journalist he is, it was at the time he was editor of Motor magazine before he moved to the States, and I think he's still around, old Howard, and you think he's a yacht, writing about yachts at these days. But anyway, he did a feature in Motor magazine, and it gave Ken's car a glowing review, and really that was the old cliche blue touch paper lighting moment, and orders flowed in. For a time, Ken continued to work at the Bridgend factory, leaving his wife Margaret, excuse me, and son Paul to run the KVA operation. And I always remember them saying that they were kept very busy because I think for every order Ken got, or KVA got, there were 60 inquiries. So just consider that for brochures. By the September of 1984, I think about 80 kits had been sold, which is pretty good going. And people clearly love the concept. It's much like a lot of sort of milestone times in the kit and specialist car industry. You know, people remember the clamour for Cobras and the clamour for Countach replicas. It's much the same as GT40s, because let's not forget, people had done their interpretation of a GT40 without really getting it anywhere near correct in terms of visuals. But it was quite apparent that more people of those 60 inquiries, the majority of them were asking about the classic, I suppose, Mark I version in terms of body shape. And indeed, KVA were happy to oblige on that, which I think was a very good move, because I believe when the music stopped, they'd sold 4 times as many Mark I's as Mark III's. I think Ford was so impressed with Ken's efforts that they even displayed one of his replicas in the foyer at Bridgend. And I'm pretty certain one of the Ford bigwigs, and there have been lots of well-known bigwigs at Ford, like Bob Lutz and Lee Iacocca, a guy called Bill Camplison, who was, I think at the time, their global marketing director. He was an early KVA customer. And not only Ken wasn't done with that, he sought the very important German, or we called it TÜV, and I think that it's a bit like that railway station in Wales, about God knows how many letters in it. I won't even try and attempt what TÜV stands for, but certainly it's an essential regulation that you need to comply with if you want to sell cars in Germany, or specialist cars or any car in Germany, I think. And commercially, and I think at the time he'd said, or figure was mentioned in dispatches in a feature, that it cost 21 grand in 2 years, but he had managed to attain it. And I think the TÜV is really, forgive the pun, tough, because you've got to go through crash testing and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, between 1983 and 1994, I think the figure was 101 KVA 40 Mark III replicas. Let's turn our attention to the Mark One. Once Ken had introduced that Mark One, as I say, he didn't look back. That came out in late '84, I think, early '85, and it's really that car that really spawned, visually anyway, the GT40 replica movement in the UK, because that's the one it seems that people really want. I think he also had access to a Mark One for his take on the KVA Mark One. Let's talk about these different chassis that KVA offered. There was a B-type chassis, which I believe was for Jaguar suspension. The C-type frame came with double wishbones that could accept Rover V8 up to Ford 302 V8, I think. And that one was quite late. It came in 1987, actually. And it wasn't, as some people would assume, a KVA C-type replica, although confusingly the company did offer a Jaguar D-type clone for a while. More on that shortly. It was the C-type version that was the TÜV approved variant. and I guess that's regarded as the sort of classic KVA 40 chassis, I suppose. And that could take up to, I think, way over 300 horsepower with ease. And I think that one came with more footwell space as well, through the way that it was triangulated, etc. And that was the one that had the closest to the original in terms of GT40 suspension. With the rear featuring, if I remember rightly, it's a long time ago, fabricated steel uprights with, I'm pretty certain, full Granada hubs located with twin trailing arms. Try saying that in a hurry. Twin trailing arms. Radius arms with fully adjustable. I think it had anti-squat geometry on that as well. Now, Ken famously had lots of sets of moulds for his cars because he had agents all over the place. And he believed in the licensing arrangement, as we've mentioned about a couple in the UK. Indeed, after GTD and MCR, DJ Sports Cars came out with their version of a GT40, the DAX 40, which indeed was a KVA, which was in association with Ken, but their own take on that. There were a couple of companies in South Africa which had KVA moulds. Rudy Mallon's KCC Kitcar company. Then I think it passed the GT40 developments and another company called Africa 40. There was a company called GT40 Replication in Australia, and I think the ERA replicas version in the States originated. I might be wrong, but certainly had maybe its origins in KVA. And Ken liked to keep an eye on things, and he used and keep his eggs weren't in one basket. So there were three companies at various times used to fabricate chassis, and a similar number of GRP laminators when things were busy, I believe. Paul Atwell took over the reins in 1988, although eventually in 1994 the whole thing was sold to a company in Florida, I think called Integrity Motors. Ken enjoyed a well-earned retirement, and I remember being out on the road one day in Wales in 2007 near Swansea, and I stopped at a post office, and I swear that I saw Ken Atwell in there, but I was in the queue, and it was a big queue, a busy post office, and unfortunately he was about 10 places in front of me, and there was no sign of him when I came out, but I'm sure I saw him. And he passed away sadly in 2017, in February the 28th. And I believe when all was said and done, there was a total of 400, at least 400 KVAs or KVA 40s sold. And let's talk briefly about any other business that KVA got into. Excuse me. And I don't believe many people are aware of these. I've talked to people about some of these other KVAs, and they think that they were just doing GT40s. They weren't. There was a Jaguar D-type replica, but all these, of course, took a real back seat to, much like GTD, a lovely T70, but I think they only sold 11 of them because, as Ray told me, they were so busy making GT40s and anything else was distraction. Even the McLaren M8F that they produced, just one of them, and that was the way it was. And similar with KVA, I think. I think it was 1988, and I think they only made one Jag D-type. I don't know the origins of that car, to be honest. And of course, they did the road-going version, the XKSS, as well. All I know is they were based on Jaguar XJ6 mechanicals with narrowed or reduced track width suspension, IRS. I think one of each of those were produced. There was a Countach replica, which I suspect had links to maybe Broadbest Primo, maybe. Could have been three of those, but again, we're kind of clutching with that. But there's certainly more Countaches made by KVA than Jaguars, I believe. And then, of course, the other, or the remaining KVA, any other business model, was a beautiful, and we've got Neil's put some photos up here of the car in question, and I think they only made the one, but it was a beautiful Maserati 450S replica. Again, origins unknown. Possibility that could have come from another genius of the specialist car industry, a guy called Bob Eggington of ASD, Automotive System Developments in Maidstone in Kent, who made a few kits such as the Miniman Hobo, but also produced other glorious one-off commissions, and he made a couple of lovely Aston Martin replicas, the DBR2 I think, and of course a birdcage 250F Maserati, and I got a funny feeling he might have developed a 450S, and that could be the car, but I don't know for sure. One thing is for sure, it's a beautiful thing, and as you can see from the photos, that one we do have documentary evidence that it existed. Anyway, then we have a notable involvement with the Ford RS200, and this is also overlooked quite a lot. This is quite an intriguing little story, and I'm going to try and keep this to less than half an hour, and I'm well on my way to achieving that, so let's press on. I think if it wasn't for the fact that at the time he was so busy with his GT40 replicas, I think Ken's subsequent involvement with the RS200 project would have been greater. He knew Stuart Turner, who was Ford's boss at Boreham, and he asked Ken if he would work with the legendary Italian carrozzeria gear to make, again, forgive my pronunciation, Maladis. Anyway, work with the Italian legends gear to make a set of body moulds from a full-size clay model made by Gear's design director, nearly 30 years service no less, and I'm very much into my Italian carrozzerias and engineers and designers. The wonderful Filippo Sapino, who also, amongst many things on his CV, is the Ferrari 512S Berliner Speciale. So he's the man that made the clay and basically the model, the outline of the RS200. Anyway, Ken visited Gear in December '83 to discuss the project, and the clay buck after these discussions was duly shipped over to Hindra-Foylan, and again, forgive me for the mispronunciation. I think it's mid-January, very early 1984. Moulds were produced. Peter Jacobs had a serious hand in that, of course, as we've mentioned, and a set of prototype GRP cardboard. I think there were several prototype sets of GRP moulds, but the first one was a GRP combo with carbon fibre, and the whole lot was shipped to the superstar that is John Thompson. Now I'm going to do a voiceover on John Thompson. He's one of these unsung heroes of the motorsport industry in the UK, and I'm definitely going to tip my hat to John. That'll be another video. You're probably thinking, who's John Thompson, or the John Thompson Associated Motorsport? Well, when you hear the video, you'll kind of find out what he's responsible for, and he keeps a far too low a profile. And I think forgive me, but I think he's getting on for 90 years of age, and he's still active. But anyway, he did his magic. He worked a lot with John Thompson. Worked a lot with Tony Southgate, actually. A lot of Tony Southgate's designs were knocked up or prototyped by John Thompson, but we'll come to that another day. Once those panels or those molds had bodies produced for them, the whole lot was shipped back to Ken, and I think that was May 1984. And then a team including RS200 project manager John Wheeler, the legend that is Tony Southgate, and Ken, with regular visits from Stuart Turner, got cracking on the project at Ken's place, I think, and they worked hard on getting the second prototype ready. I think they had a time limit on that. I don't know what the time limit was, but they were given a target. And at this stage, of course, there was no huge rear spoiler or distinctive roof mounted oil cooler, but it was an outline of an RS200. The prototype, I think, also featured three-door Sierra, Ford Sierra doors. Remember the three-door Sierra? They were rare. And Ken cut 9 inches out the bottom of them to get them to fit. And this is where it gets well, sketchy really. I think Stuart Turner is said to have placed an order for 6 more prototype body sets from KVA, but Ken turned the order down because he was so busy with KVA 40s. And there we are. So that really rounds up the story in a nutshell, in a 26-minute nutshell, of KVA and Ken Atwell, a man that earned his place in the Kitcar Hall of Fame, if there was one.
So you have a Le Mans car for the road, the GT40, and at the same time in the 1980s as the KVA GT40 and the GTD40, which you will see on a previous example of this series. But if you go back to the 1980s, we had the Kitcar Racing Series, and several manufacturers made their name in the Kitcar Racing Series. Westfield really blossomed with their Westfield 11, and at the same time, the Silver Leader and Silver Striker really made the name for that manufacturer, and they grew from the Kitcar Racing Series. And those were the manufacturers that were at the top end in their class when this car suddenly dropped onto the paddock and blew everyone away. It was really like a Group C car suddenly is available for the everyday kit car buyer, a true supercar. It was the ultimate.
Let's get rid of some housekeeping straight away. If you haven't already done so, please hit the subscribe button. At least hit the like as well. And if you've got a hype button, whatever the hell that is, hit that as well, because I've been asked to say that. I'm not sure what that is or what it does, but it must be good. So hit that as well, please. All joking aside, if I think it does the channel enormous amounts of good if you do like and subscribe, because it puts us in front of more people and puts it in their feeds. I think that's what they call it. I'm busking that, as you can probably tell, but I'm not really. I'm a dinosaur and proud to trying to live still in an analog world, although losing that battle. You never believe how hard it is for me to do these, but feedback I get says that some people enjoy them, so we'll crack on. And in fact, anything else aside, I think it's great to be able to show some of these photos from our archive. I'd much rather the people saw them and enjoyed them than leave them sitting in a filing cabinet or on a computer file somewhere. So that's what we aim to do: celebrate the history of the Kitcar, the UK's Kitcar industry from 1949. And today I've got a cracker. I know I always say that, but we got a real cracker today. And I don't know really. I'm up to about February 2026 when I'm recording this one. We're up to about 126 videos, I think, unbelievably now. So it's quite a lot. But I don't know why it's taken me all this time to do this one. Although I probably do. What am I talking about? I'm talking about Ultima. A shining beacon, a shining light for the kit car industry. Incredible. I remember someone, a mainstream motoring journalist who remain nameless, who smugly told me that he thought Ultimas were a very expensive kit car, which, yeah, they're a substantial amount of money, but you get what you pay for and you end up with something that is totally stunning. But my retort to him was, well, not really. It's actually a very affordable, pocket money price almost, supercar. And that kind of kept him quiet, or made him sort of think again. And there's no two ways about it. The Ultima, certainly in larger engined versions, is a proper supercar, and a world renowned and respected one too. But it's very much using a football analogy. It's very much a game of two halves. We're going to talk about the history in a minute, and we'll try and do it a little bit chronologically. But of course, the Marlowe family took over the marque in 1992, I think. But it had been founded and established by the one and only Lee Noble, who I'm very pleased to be able to call a mate. I've known Lee since the mid-80s. Someone more forthright and calling a sledgehammer a JCB bucket I've never met in my life. I respect him immensely for that, because I just know that if I get some facts wrong here, he'll be he'll be on to me. But we'll have a go. We'll have a go. And indeed, I know we all know Lee for his fabulous designs over the years, particularly, I suppose, the Noble M12, which remains, in my eyes, one of the greatest cars I've ever driven in my life. Oh, and he hates platitudes. He hates praise like that. So he'll be hating that. If he's listening to this, he'll hate that. But it's true. The Noble M12 and its derivatives is a simply fantastic car. And I know I'm on safe ground there, because I know an awful lot of people share that view. But in case you didn't know Lee's history, he starts off with the Ultima back in 1983. Now, Lee's got a great history. I mean, he was well into his model aeroplanes when he was a youngster. He's been mad about cars all his life, obviously. Definitely raced the Lotus Europa with real success as well. And I think, I'm not sure actually if the Ultima was inspired by the Lotus Europa or his love for Group C racing, which I think that's it really. Though it's a sort of combination of things, no doubt. Certainly a historic Lotus fan, hence the Lotus Europa. But when he and his father were sat on the bank, and I think it might have been Donington, it might have been Mallory, it might have been neither of those two, but that's one of those two, I'm sure it is. Watching the then fledgling, I think certainly 1984, I suspect, the first season of the Kitcar Challenge run by the 750 Motor Club, I think Lee was automatically attracted to the series. Although Lotus did make kit cars until 1973, the Europa wasn't available or certainly not available in kit. Well, not as much. The Elan could be classed as being a component car, I guess, and I think they did offer the Europa in CKD, complete knockdown form, but it couldn't really be described as a kit car. So I think that sort of inspired Lee to design, or sort of inspired by the stuff he loved, Porsche 956s and such like, 917s. And I remember when I started at Link House Magazines, who published Kit Cars and Specials mag in those days, a colleague of mine, Simon, I always remember him saying that, crikey, I can't wait to see Lee Noble's Group C car at Stoneleigh, which was the venue then for the National Kit Car Motor Show. And I always remember him saying that, and it was 1984, 85, I think, when we all saw the car and everybody's jaws just dropped straight to the floor because they couldn't quite believe it. A famous car. The registration plate was NUT602P. That was Lee's prototype Ultima that he began work on in 1983. I think at that time at his parents' house, Jill and Tony, Lutterworth in Leicestershire. Now, I'm sure it's Lutterworth, it's certainly around that area. We have to give credit to Lee's mum Jill for, I think when he was looking for a name for his new project, it was Jill that came up with the name Ultima. So take a bow, Mrs. Noble. You certainly started something with that name, that's for sure. Certainly that we're going to come to the race. We can't really jump too far ahead really, so I'll just try and go through this, as I say, in order really. It's difficult because I've got to interject slightly with various bits and pieces as we go. But the Mark 1, the prototype, the car with the registration plate I just mentioned, and the car that really put Lee on the map, I suppose, and certainly put the Ultima on the map, didn't actually exist in production form. It was only ever a prototype. But by crikey, it caused a huge stir. I remember the Kitcar Action Day. We used to have action days at various circuits, which basically meant manufacturers displayed their wares at motor circuit. Usually Castle Combe or Mallory Park were our two English destinations. We did, because the magazine I worked for, Kit Cars and Specials, we sponsored those events. And we definitely had one at Knockhill in Scotland, which was brilliant. So basically the manufacturers would turn up, instead of having a stand in a show hall, they would display their wares outdoor in the paddock at circuits. and with the added bonus that not only could people look at the cars, they could be taken for a passenger ride in them as well. They were very successful for that time. And indeed, I kind of nicked the idea and developed it a little bit for my own Total Kitcar live events in the mid-noughties. No rocket science there. That was how they worked. But anyway, so I remember Lee turning up at Mallory Park, and he took me for a ride in that car, actually, and by crikey, unbelievable. People just, it was so fast, it was incredible compared to a lot of the other machinery. And if you wanted a performance car, then people automatically aspired to, well, I suppose people aspired to a Porsche 917 or a 956, but there was no chance really of owning one of those. Although I think didn't Vern Schuppen produce a road-going Porsche 962 in the sort of late 90s? Unbelievable. Anyway, but if you wanted your own Le Mans racer, the Ultima would give you the sort of the ambition to own your own version of it, I suppose. Powered, so people are often surprised, powered by nothing more than a Renault V6 from a Renault 30, a production car at the time, teamed up with a Renault UN1 transaxle. Although it didn't just use Renault parts, Lee used various manufacturers' parts bins for components. Other cars that supplied bits and pieces were Ford, Lancia and Austin, believe it or not. The Mark II was developed while the Mark I, the prototype, was actually causing such a stir and being publicised in various magazines. And indeed, you'll see that Neil will put up a couple of front covers from magazines of that time. One was Kitcars and Specials, indeed, which made the front cover of. That was a very good selling, big selling issue. That you can't always say it's because a magazine sells well because of the front cover, but there's a pretty good chance that the main shot on the front cover is the attraction, the hook. And also Sports Car Monthly did a feature on a couple of, I think they did that cover that Neil's going to put up there, shows the first production, the Mark II, and Lee's old faithful. The Mark II was 99% mechanically. Maybe I think I'm pretty safe there. 99% mechanically as per the prototype Mark I, but the rear suspension was now featured some of Lee's own fabricated parts, including the alloy uprights. And the Marlowe family, as I've mentioned, Richard Noble. Well, that's actually quite an interesting slip, isn't it? Richard Noble, a very famous and legendary land speed campaigner, of course. But sorry about that. Richard Marlowe, Ted Marlowe's son, now has been running the Ultima Sports Mark for quite a few years now. But his father, Ted, who ran a company called Marlowe Civil Engineering at that time, was the first Noble Motorsport customer. And indeed, I think Lee traded as a kit deal. If you wanted to buy a car in kit form, or Noble Motorsport was for turnkeys and other endeavours. Ted had been racing. He was in the first season, maybe the second, but certainly the mid-80s formation or formative years of the Kitcar Challenge series. He raced a very potent Dutton B plus model with a spiteful little engine, 4-cylinder engine built by Swaymar. If you know your Ford tuners, Swaymar were a very well known and well regarded Ford tuner, and he did very well with that. But he was very, very taken by the Ultima, as I said, most people were, and he was indeed Lee's first customer, I'm almost certain, for an Ultima kit, Mark II. And that, I think Ted likes a nice engine, and that Ultima of his had a 3.1 litre V6 Essex. From a Capri, I think the RS 3100 model. Understandably, Lee and Ted really dominated for 2-3 years the Kitcar Challenge. It became, I think, after a couple of years the Kitcar Championship. But Lee won the championship twice, 1986-87, and he and Ted shared, dominated really. And shared a lot of wins over those 2 seasons. more than 2 seasons. It certainly changed the face of the racing. As you can see, we're going to put some early there's a couple of racing photos from those days, as well as some of the earlier pictures of and a young Lee there with his mother and father. You would have already seen, I think, by now. And certainly they were a dynamic duo, Ted and Lee. I think they had a matching pair of Granada V6 tow cars that they towed their respective Ultimas to the tracks with. And I think they would each call each. I think they fell out a few times, but as I say, they were Team Ultima, and they were all dominant for a couple of seasons there. There was there was always kind of severe competition between them. I remember Lee got a particularly well-tuned Renault V6 engine, which was much sort of faster than the one it replaced, and it prompted Ted to then go the Chevy V8 route. I think Lee was dominating with that, particularly dominant with that tuned Renault engine. So Ted went and got, I think it was a 327 Chevy V8. Indeed, the first American V8 to be fitted to an Ultima, I'm pretty certain. When he put that engine in that Ultima, I think it was a Formula 5000 spec engine. It certainly put him at front of the field for a time. I think from memory, he often won by more than 4 seconds ahead of Lee, who in turn was a good distance in front of the third place finisher. And I think it has to be said, much of the field were quite upset at being lapped at least twice in a 10 or 12 lap race, which probably would sort of peeve you a little bit. And I think that the differentials between speed were pronounced, really. I think if you've watched the Le Mans coverage over the years, we've always been to Le Mans indeed, and I always think the GT cars and the C2 cars are pretty darn quick. I mean, we're talking highly tuned Porsche 911s in the GT class, but you'll be aware a C2 blows past them like they're standing still, and in turn a C1 top of the shop class, the top class, would just pass a GT car like it was standing still and swamp a C2 car. And that was the differentials in speed. I mean, the back of the grid in the kit car, there must have been 15-20 seconds difference between the front to the back of the grid, really. Ted did go to town on that. I think he actually christened. Yeah, he has. It might be a photo coming up. He sort of christened his Ultima, the Ultima 5000. Excuse me. It certainly had a Porsche transaxle rather than a Renault one. At that time, it would have been a 4-speed. He revised suspension. The bodywork was slightly revised, and yeah, unbelievable, really. 1989, Lee commissioned Clive Smart's Shapecraft operation in Northampton, the masters of metal bashing, to create a new Ultima body, which was the Mark III. And I guess that became, or the first signs of the definitive shape that we all recognise as an Ultima, really. Although it has to be said, if you look at the latest RS, which is a fantastic car, although the similarities are there, totally different design, totally different car. It's a night and day difference, but I'm talking just visuals. From that Mark III in aluminium, a GRP glass fibre mould was taken, of course. A new space frame chassis was developed at the same time. Renault V6 was still order of the day. Lee toyed with the idea of a race spec version Spider convertible. And things were moving with Ultima. I mean, not just 750 Motor Club success, but as a Kitcar company, they certainly were continued to turn heads. And I like the fact that Lee continued to develop the product. Meanwhile, Ted Marlowe further upgraded his stonking V8. He stroked it to a 377 cubic inch engine, 6.2 litre V8, complete with Kinsler fuel injection. And the two continued to dominate the series, really. Other Ultima drivers also competed heavily. A lovely chap called Bob Light, a very capable driver. He was continuing to win Castle Combe GT races right into the late 80s, maybe beyond that really, in his Ultima. Consummate driver. And another guy called Nigel James. He'd been in the Kitcar series before, from 1985, from 84, the first season indeed, in a Dutton Phaeton. I think a couple of various Phaetons, and was a very proved how good a driver he was there. I think he also had a Shapecraft Lotus 15 replica for a time, an SR15 they called that, before he too graduated to an Ultima. It was quite a battle at the front at those times. Anyway, 1999, Leo was said that the Ultima was classed as being too fast for the 750 championship. Read into that what you will, but certainly it wasn't eligible for the series, I don't think, from that time. So Ultima continued to flourish. It wouldn't be long before Lee moved on to other projects. Namely, he did the Ferrari P4 inspired car that later became was taken over by Neil Foreman, of course. 1991, Ted bought a Mark III kit, Ultima Mark III kit, for road use. But typically, he re-engineered it to suit his own purposes. He fitted a Chevy 350, a 5.7 litre, complete with Motec fuel injection and ubiquitous, or what became standard really, Porsche transaxle. And I think the road version of the Ultima that he built was a beautiful car. That's the red car. You'll see it one of the photos. Oh no, we may not. I couldn't find a photo of that. I do apologise. No, but anyway, it certainly gave Ted food for thought in terms of what was possible from a road perspective. And around about this time, I think McLaren were still working on, or Gordon Murray and Peter Stevens designed, well, it's a legendary car, the McLaren F1, 3-seat central driving position. While they were doing the development work, they bought two Ultima Mark IIIs from Noble Motorsport to use during development of the fabled F1. They were impressed by the fine levels of engineering. It's the Ultima speed that they noticed on track, its lap times, and the race history of the Mark II and Mark III. So Lee sold them chassis 12 and chassis 13, later denoted as being called the Heavenly Twins. Number 12 was nicknamed by McLaren as Albert, and that was used to test a new BMW gearbox, and it was attached to a Chevy engine, and it was used to gauge and test and develop sort of torque levels of that BMW V12 engine, and they were kind of working on that with Albert. And it did, I think they gave that car, they amended that car or modified that car to have a central driving position, and they gave it carbon brakes. Again, clues as to the F1. Chassis 13 was nicknamed Edward, and that was used to test the BMW V12 engine, performance parameters and such like, and cooling system. And again, that was heavily modified. I think they were so impressed, McLaren, with those cars that they actually created their own Edward and Albert badges for the noses. Sadly, I think those cars were destroyed after they finished with them. About 1992, Ted Marlowe bought the Ultima project. Lee had decided to move on, and the Marlowes bought the rights, jigs and moulds, etc. to Ultima Mark II and Mark III, thus turning their hobby into a new business venture. Between 1983 or 1985, really, when he got going properly, Lee had sold 26 units, including 13 of them. Half of them were Mark IIIs. But the Marlows set up shop in Long Itchington in Warwickshire, and they wanted to, talking about Ted being inspired by the road ability of the Ultima Mark III that he'd built, they wanted to pursue the idea of a affordable road-going supercar to be supplied in kit form. That was always the intention, and still is. You are still able to buy an Ultima in kit form. Did a lot of designing, did a lot of development work. Ted's car was used as a demo car and a development car. Came up with a new chassis jig to officially, for the first time, I think, incorporate Chevy V8. I think Ted had done it, but I don't think it was. Lee may well tell me I'm wrong and being stupid, but I don't think until that point it was officially available. They also incorporated stuff like the latest Porsche transaxle, twin fuel tanks, new steering, cooling, pedals, suspension, even seats were redesigned or redeveloped. I think that transaxle was a Porsche G50. So the first, I guess it was the Mark IV, but the Marlows called it the Ultima Sports, appeared in 1993. Worked quite closely with a well-known sports car engineer called Steve Smith, who was heavily involved in its design and development. And I do believe that Ultima Sports still work with Steve Smith. I think he had some involvement on the latest RS model. And it was 1993 they moved to where they're still based, in Hinckley, although not to the current site. We'll come to that. They moved to another unit first off in Hinckley. I think, remembering that Lee had done the one-off Spider, the Marlows decided to create an official Spider model. It was different to Lee's version, but they used it certainly as the inspiration. And I remember that was the convertible version at that time, was always intended as, it seems almost churlish to use the word budget and associate it with Ultima in the same sentence, but it was, I think, a budget build. It was certainly Rover V8 powered, was the intended engine, with a Renault UN1 transaxle. But the cars were wind tunnel tested at Myra. And they continued to flourish. I mean, by 1997, I think they'd reached 150 sales, and that's the Marlow sales. So that's good going in 4 or 5 years. 1998, they moved to their current site, the large unit that they occupy still in Hinckley, and that was the year they also really accelerated with model development to come up with a car to replace the Sports, and that car was the GTR, which again, like all Ultima models, has its own identity. They worked, I think they looked quite closely then for the GTR aerodynamics to give it more downforce. It was built with the then new, because it came in 1998, SVA test or SVA requirements, now IVA requirements, of course. And they also wanted to simplify, I think, the kit build process. 1999, they updated the body moulds and emphasised the point that the glass fibre was so good that the gel coat, as we called it, was so good no paint was required. And that was via, if you've heard of Quantum Sports Cars, the other side of Quantum Sports Cars, who were a famous Kitcar company of the day, of course, was Quantum Mouldings, run by the third brother, Peter Waldridge. Sorry. 2001, the Can-Am convertible replaces the Spider. That was a particularly clever introduction then of it run with a fly screen, but you could almost quick change it to a conventional windscreen and vice versa. And and I think that windscreen enabled them to come up with some weather gear, a convertible soft top. And I remember speaking to Ted about the Spider the Can-Am at the time, and he described it as just being featuring more refinements than the Spider had. And the Can-Am was indeed launched at Stoneleigh National Kitcar Motor Show in 2001. So that was the same year that they'd reached 400 sales, which again is, you can see it accelerated considerably. 2004, Richard and Ted decided to prove the credentials of the car, or the cars, and they had a go at several world speed records, I suppose you'd call them. The 0 to 100 to 0, I think, was the first one. They used a standard production, as they called it, GTR 640, 640 denoting the brake horsepower, because at that time I think they'd started working closely with an American engine company called American Speed, which I think is now part officially of the Ultima Sports business, I think. Richard did the driving, and it gained him some incredible publicity. And that first world record was 10.3 seconds, 0 to 100 to 0, which was half a second quicker than the existing record of the time. And the numbers involved in that were incredible, really. 0 to 60 came up in 2.8 seconds, 0 to 100 in 5.9, and then 100 to 0 sub 4 seconds. Incredible. And what made it even more admirable, really, was that it was in road spec using road tyres. And they again highlighted the fact that it had, for want of a better description, heavy extras such as aircon. It didn't have traction control, didn't have launch control, or neither did it have ABS. So it was very much a road-going car, powered by a 377 Ci Chevy. And Richard always drove from the factory to the venue, again proving the versatility and the ability of the car. And that the GTR 640 became a specific model in the Ultima lineup. I think he wanted to prove that the car was a genuine road-going Ultima. It wasn't a trailer queen, as he called it, and it certainly didn't have a special one-off grenade engine. The GTR 685 was the next record breaker. That was in 2005. They'd hiked their engine power up to 685. Another world record for the 0 to 100 to 0. They cut it back to 9.8. And they did it again in 2006 with a GTR 720. And as we can see, the engines were getting more powerful. Excuse me. And they cut it back to 9.4 seconds. It wasn't long before the LS series, GM LS engines came along, and they were on stream. LS1, LS2, LS3, LS6, LS7, any of those were available. Popular engines, anyone that's got a modern day Cobra or such like. Kitcar, for example, using an LS, it's a wonderful engine. It's elastic power. It's economical comparatively for a V8. And in an Ultima, it could be available from 340 horsepower right up to 800 at the time. Even a luminary of world endurance racing, Andy Wallace, and a noted test driver, I think, for Bugatti Veyron in later years, Andy Wallace was invited to drive and test drive the Ultima 720, GTR 720. And I know that at one stage, I think it's widely known, but Richard by that time had kind of beginning to take over the company. He privately hired the Top Gear camera team, or the BBC camera team, at Dunsfold, which is obviously, if you watch the later episodes, the Clarkson era Top Gear program, you know that the Stig would test the cars at Dunsfold Aerodrome near Guildford, Dunsfold, in fact. And if I've read something there's an Ultima book which is well worth a read, beautifully produced book by the factory. Richard said it was very expensive in terms of the same price as at the time a brand new family car. But they did it at Dunsfold and proved the ability of the car. Did it twice, in fact. 2008 they attacked the road car record time at the Nürburgring in Germany. And by 2009 they were selling, I think they've sold up over 65 countries now, so they weren't not just selling in the UK. And upgrades such as the Porsche 996, 997 transaxle were now regular fitment, standard fitment to an Ultima really. In 2013 they did a special display at Stoneleigh, which was really lovely to see, because it included Lee Noble was present, and it included 602, sorry, N602, NUT 602P, beg your pardon, taking pride of place, as it deserved to, on a rotating like turntable thing, on a pride of place on the Ultima stand at Stoneleigh National Kitcar Motor Show. As regards the current Ultima models, the 2015 the Ultima Evolution in coupe and convertible forms arrived. Another heavy development, revisions to chassis and suspension and such like. Cemented their position right at the sort of pinnacle of the specialist car industry. And not content with that, in 2019 we're going to put some pictures of the orange car. That's a latest RS, what they call Ultima RS model, powered by an LT4 engine. Prodigious again, more, it's like a latest development of the GMLS, now known as the LT. And I do believe you can order from the factory engines way over 1,000 horsepower. Incredible. And I think the RS, to me, I love an orange car, but the RS just makes me drool. Absolutely fantastic. What are you going to spend on an Ultima? Well, no secret of fact. I mean, you're going to spend £150,000, I would think, plus. Fact of the matter, but you're going to end up with a wondrous car, a cut price supercar, indeed. And the RS with the LT4 is Euro 6 compliant. It's got the latest fuel injection. It's got the latest everything really, and that was launched at the Goodwood Festival of Speed in 2019. So anyway, that kind of rounds up. I wanted to keep it to under half an hour. I'm afraid I couldn't. I've gone over, so I do apologise. But I think the subject matter is enough to keep people interested. I've tried to be chronological. I didn't want to dwell too long and bore you to death, but I hope we've given you a sort of insight in case you knew of Noble but didn't know of Ultima, etc, etc. Didn't know much about Ultima. If you knew about the kit car, specialist cars and cars in general, then you would, of course, but I'm not so sure everybody realises how far back the marque can trace its history and how it's evolved over the years. A fantastic shining light for the UK's kit car industry, that's for sure. Sure, you can buy a turnkey one. I think you're going to have to expect a 2 or 3 year waiting list at least, I think, for them, and that's how popular they are. The factory is making them as fast as they can turn them out. But it certainly is a car that makes you proud of the UK specialist car industry, as many marques do, but the Ultima's got its own place. Incidentally, I should have actually included it in the main text. Lee's got a brilliant book, a real thumper, called Lee Noble, Supercar Genius, and you can't go far wrong with that title. As far as I'm concerned, Lee is a genius, and deserves much credit for what he's obviously created over the years. Anyway, it's available from Veloce, and that's Veloce, veloce.co.uk. I'm 99% certain it's still in print. I guess you could always look at that site called eBay and find a copy there. Cover price £60, but shop around and you may be able to find it cheaper. Written by a guy called Chris Cato, who's done a brilliant job. Really, really recommend this book. It kind of deserved to sell a lot more than it has, I think. So if I can get Lee a couple of sales, he's well deserved. Anyway, Lee Noble, Supercar Genius. In the history of the kit car industry. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you want to read about specialist cars, etc., and you want to read them on the web, since 2001 I've been updating my website, totalkitcar.com, every Friday. If you haven't already been, or you haven't been for a while, do come along and join us. It's available free, 24/7, 365 days a year, and you never know what you're going to find on there to interest you. And of course, the magazine is a physical paper magazine on wood-free paper and oil-free ink, I'm proud to say, but top quality paper and top quality ink. And in fact, someone said to me the other day they loved the magazine even more for the smell. So there you go. And it has got an intoxicating smell, actually. I do like that. In fact, when the printer changed their printing machine a couple of years back, one of the stipulations was that it was okay, great you're doing that, and great for technology to advance, but you've got to keep that smell. I told you I was a dinosaur. Anyway, I digress. Thanks very much for visiting wherever you are in the world. I really appreciate you giving up a chunk of your day, and I hope you have enjoyed this. I'm sorry I've gone on longer than I really wanted to, but the subject matter deserved it, I think, and I hope you've enjoyed this video. Come back, and if you haven't searched our entire catalogue, do so. Please do so. Anyway, have a great day, and I'll see you down the road.
If that isn't a reason enough to like and subscribe, I don't know what is. But if you are feeling generous, please do hit that bell, hit the drop down and click on all, and that will help the channel enormously. Thank you ever so much.